So good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for this conference. I'm very much looking forward to meeting all of you and discovering your research. Obviously, I will try to understand what you're saying, but it will probably come in time. So my purpose today is has to do with the literature of strings and an area of the literature that's very interesting to me. And I have done a little bit of work before on that overall repertoire of the duet for two violins, a very specific type of repertoire. And now I'm focusing today on this school of Piedmont, or the school that is associated with the founder of it, Mr. Somis, Jean-Baptiste Somis, Giovanni Battista Somis. So we know there are many students that were very important for the history of the violin and the literature that also produce duets. And it's part of the specific angle I take about this repertoire is that it goes from a teacher to a student who becomes a teacher who teaches other students. And you can follow that track of production of duets. So why? Part of the reason is that it is a good instrument to teach because the mentor and the students are learning either together. The students are playing duets for the teacher, or the teacher plays duets with the students. And I think it's an important repertoire that we should know well. It used to be much more in fashion to use duets to teach. However, this has disappeared gradually with a greater emphasis on solo repertoire and concertos and so on. But within that world of the literature of the duet are many gems that are worth discovering or rediscovering. And we have, with friends of mine, recorded many of these duets, and I'm waiting to get into the production of these recordings to show you a panorama of the French repertoire, of the Italian repertoire, of the Russian repertoire, all very much influenced by the very roots that are here in Turin and area from Somis and from Tartini, from the other side of Italy. So the school of Tartini I talked about a little while ago, and now I'm going to talk about the school here of Turin. So let me check. So in some cases, what is interesting in the case of the duet is that the blueprint for the composition of duets is quite established. It's even if you go through 50 duets or 60 duets and you look at them, and I analyzed many of those, they often come down to the same structure. It's a very simple structure, usually with 2 or 3 movements, a fast, a slow, a fast movement. And then in this fast movement, you will have a cut that is in between that involves a repetition, and a second part that is at the dominant level, and then your a recapitulation. So it's in the development of the sonata form. It's also an important laboratory towards that classical sonata model that we know much about and that has been developed for many more instruments up to the symphony. So the duets also provide a wonderful window for living again the history of the violin. So that is to go through what the gestures of the composers and the artists have been experiencing and promoting on stage or in the context of the school or at home. So there was quite a market for violin duets at the time, and you can see it in the catalogs of different publishers. And I have tried to follow these various composers in their catalogs and finding the music. It's very good nowadays with Petrucci in the libraries. We are able to reach that material in original form, look at the sometimes transcriptions, make corrections, and so on. So this material is preserved in most cases. And actually, in the case of Ideali, trattenimenti, there's some of the first, all of the first violin is extant, but some of the second violin has disappeared. But I'm going to say this is a nice genius mission for us, because it should not be such a difficult thing to finish the work of Somis in this case. And I'll explain this in a few minutes. I have in the chamber music area altogether, at the time, you can consider trio sonatas, 2 violins plus a bass or an harpsichord. There would be quartets, and in instruments that were treble instruments, violins sometimes could be substituted to flutes or dessus de viol. So in the case of the French composers, they would be substituting, no problem. That was not a big issue. And considering the market too, the music was devised sometimes for an amateur market. So some people who were not necessarily very skilled at the instrument, but wanted to play and play well. So the composers had in mind also this market of amateurs that were dedicated to learn. And one of those amateurs, for example, was Thomas Jefferson, of all people in America, was collecting works from composers from Italy and playing them in America. So imagine that over time, this was an important driver for the composers to also sometimes limit their writing to the particular market. And we have, in case all the way to Russia, I was mentioning Kandoshkin, or local composers who were trained through Italy, or Italian musicians outside of Italy, and developing their own style of duet playing. And you have colorful changes in allure of these duets. Considering another case is that the duet could be an instrument for virtuosity. So you would have a violinist that would be very skilled, that would kind of challenge others or colleagues to play together. And those duets would be an opportunity for somewhat emulation. And the further idea that I want to convey to you about duets is that you can consider duets that would be played with one violin. So the idea of duetizing, and the idea of having a violin play and a second violin adding another line on the spot. So improvising accompaniment. And that is an important skill also that some people will say have been lost over time, but it's in the world of improvisation. Maybe now more in jazz. So this chain of production I've been mentioning about is 300 years old or so. If we go to Somis and we go 300 years old back, he was 37 years old. He was very active. He was director in Turin, as you know. He was a long time master of ceremonies of sort for music, and had many students under his leadership. And he would be soon recognized across Europe with his concerts going to Paris at the Concerts Spirituels. I think the duet is not an endangered species of sort. It is an important one and will be cultivated. And I hope that people in Italy also will join in this adventure in developing duets. I have here history that I think is developing in tangible ways. So if we are looking at developing also a strong violin community, I think the duet is a perfect vehicle. So going down now to the road of Somis. So now I'm going to, is it just that I need to here? Okay, so yes. So I mentioned here about the lineages, and then we have the Piemontese school. So he was a student of Corelli. So we all go all the way to the very beginning of the violin we just talked about through the instruments. Thank you very much for that lovely talk. And as the instrument got established and we had Corelli as one leading figure, his students also took important roles. So among these students here, we have Giardini, that is sometimes related to Lorenzo, but maybe has been corrected. I'm not sure exactly, but I will look at these names, which are very famous names, but in their the special angle of their duet. And as I mentioned, it can be appreciated in different ways to develop essential skills in reading, chamber music, and even composition, which is not something that we often think about nowadays about the conservatory teaching. So in the context of Tartini School, we have a bunch of students of Tartini that also have established a duet repertoire from Nardini, Ferrari, Sirman, Naumann, and many others, Paganelli, and so on. So we have quite a bit to compare to, and something that you see gradually a development of an internationalizing style. So the classical or the galant or the rococo and so on. So all people tend towards the same language, the same forms. As for looking quickly at Mr. Somis, I was just mentioning, so he was very powerful here in this area, and he had studied for a few years with Corelli, so appreciated the forms and appreciated the style, and got into actually a French and Italian connection. So students would come to him because he was mostly living in Turin and take lessons in violin playing and composition for that instrument. So we know of him these works, and Opus 7 you see gradually through this development. So it's towards the end of his production, and it's not something that we would say is a very difficult thing. It's more for amateurs. It was simpler and in his overall technique than Tartini's, which was very ornamented and so on. So here clearly meant for amateurs. And as I mentioned, after duet 4, there's not much. So stylistic features, and that's something that I want to discuss quickly. So usually there's a cut in the first and third movements, and many of these duets, actually towards the end, they will be all just 2 movements long, so no middle movement. And there's a super abundance of thirds and sixths. It's as if you could play them alone, all in thirds. The only moments where you don't see thirds is at the cadences, where it becomes 6 going to octave, and that's it. So this gives you a sense of the simplicity of this music. And when it is a walking bass against a melody, so in the case of, I think that's the most interesting thing about Somis, is the phrase structure is often quite unorthodox. And groups of 2s and 3s making phrases very free, not the usual 4-bar frame. So often rhythmically identical parts and voices are exchanged. So that's an important part of the duet, is a pure dialogue between equal parts. Usually that's how you would imagine this is the ideal of a treatment of chamber music, is all the people are treated equally. So there's lots of that exchange taking place. Modulations, as I mentioned, well, there will be somewhat a simple frame for modulations. It will develop a little bit over time, but not that much. And there's usually a tritone that's announced, and then it will be confirmed. It is either half cadence or full cadence. We see a variety in that construction, but it's a very, very simple model to show and to put into application. There are strokes or types of gestures that are very common in the violin world. So the coulé, the legato, 2 slurs, gestures that you will see over and over. And we will see lots of examples in a few minutes if you can be patient. So there will be lots of these coulées, bariolage, so over 3 strings, over 2 strings with a drone and such. Arpeggiations, duplets and triplets, often a combination of 2 and 2 and 1 2 3 2 and 2 and 1 2 3. So this creates variety in the language. Dotted rhythm, tiam papam papam, and combining these. There are lots of sequences modulating because we're in Italy and we're the land of Vivaldi. So there's circle of fifths and such, and that keeps creating variety in the discourse. It's not always the same. Non-modulating tonicizing events up and down the tetrachords. The tetrachord is a very important concept to see the structure. So when a composer starts to write a bunch of bars, it is usually organized around ascending or descending tetrachord. And even the chromatic tetrachord is used in some places. You will see in Leclerc, not so much, a little bit in Guillaume as well, but not in Somis for sure. So, and we have some effects sometimes like horn fifths and pastoral events, things like drones of open string that take place. So I will just continue quickly. So here we're going to go now with a few examples. So that gives you a sense of Somis music. Very short pieces that stand in wind, and I put violin 1 and violin 2 so you can see what I'm meaning about the thirds. It's just covered with thirds, and it's essentially all coulées or little movements up and down. But it works. It's a very charming music. I'll give you a few more examples. Largo. So these figures, it's very agreeable to do, and with some bariolage in the sense of having a drone that rings along that helps for the resonance of only 2 instruments playing together. In a room like this, it fills the place, no question. And 2 violins can do that. That's why it's ideal, very practical and very effective. And then you can push on the tempos if you want to go a little bit fast. Allegro is open to interpretation. 3/8 can be very fast as a matter of interpretation of an allegro. So it often finishes with something that sounds like a gigue or in a 3/8 pattern. 6/8, 3/8. Okay, so I'm giving you a few more. Whoops, something got lost there. So duetto 2, some more of the same. It's often the case that grazioso will be part of the character of the piece, and it is often by the character of the key that we judge the way of playing things. So it's an interesting aspect that it's like the word dolce or the word grazioso is implying that you have to approach the instrument in a certain way. Lots of little ornamentations along the way, and I'm guessing that he would not mind adding more or less, but this is effectively asking for some creativity in playing with the text. We see also here the structure of repeats in the last movement, as I mentioned before. Another key, and more coulées and different forms of coulées, sometimes 3 notes, sometimes 2 notes, figures that also Vivaldi would use frequently. And repeated notes and triplets even of repeated to create excitement, or to create here, I don't know, in the context of Largo, to create maybe a sense of languor. Many patterns are repeated, and I'm assuming this would be composed very quickly. So here you have dotted rhythms and marcato markings with staccato of the bow. So you have ta ta ta, ya ta ta ta, ya ta ta ta. So maybe just to teach kids to learn how to do differences. This is the last movement we know of Somis that is in the duet form. It's completely thirds. It's just thirds. Essentially just thirds. Okay, now moving to a student of the most important Italian student of Somis is Pugnani. And here I kind of summarized from the Grove entry the important aspects of his life as a career. So he came back to Turin and then actually toured Northern Europe with Viotti. And that is important because that's another aspect of the concert life of the time, is that a teacher would introduce music with the support of a student, or introduce the student with the support of the teacher. And that was part of the logic of the time. So it's he may have done that with Borghi Bruni, Prolidro, but we know especially about Viotti. And I'm going to carry on. So some stylistic features. It's interesting because there's more and more appoggiaturas and ornamentations on big beats. So that's in the galant style. Again, parallel thirds. The arch-like melodies are maybe more fluid and flowing. Lots of balancing triplets against dotted rhythms and so on. So a little bit entry into the relative minors in the structure, so to create changes. And some of the composers, for example, Leclerc's student, we were just noticing Chevalier, who also wrote Chevalier de Saint-Georges, also wrote duets, but he usually forget the minor part. He usually doesn't include, but Italians usually add the impetus for more contrast with the minor mode. Embroideries, trills, and so on. Sometimes you have double trills. It's all lots of effects and beautiful aspects. And the final gesture is usually in the lower register to calm down. Occasionally, he's very interesting, and Pugnani has this specific aspect that I feel is forward-looking. Sometimes elides. So he uses form that has been already said and different ideas, and as he repeats them, he compacts them together. So that, I think, is an interesting, surprising compositional aspect. Lots of suspensions, syncopations, and so on. And in the last item on IMSLP is an autograph where he shows fermatas, where cadenzas would be expected. So here are some examples from Pugnani. Already you see much more complex writing. With here it's in score form, so you don't have to compare side by side. It's useful this way. But you see that it's very, it follows closely. Other examples, well, examples of trills like this, and rhythms. It's always good to see also the exchanges. Here, long suspensions that creates beautiful effects, so longing effects. And otherwise, well done music, simple to follow. Yeah, so there's a variety in the style of Pugnani that I like very much, and I think you will appreciate, and it's enjoyable altogether. So here, yeah, some other figures sometimes that seem to be coming from opera, and we know that Pugnani was opera composer, so sometimes some of these figures have an operatic figure. Okay, the next one is Guillaume, who was from France and then studied with Somis, and he established himself first in the south and then came to Paris and was a duet player with Guignon. And Guignon, in case you don't know, Guignon was kind of a interesting figure in a power hungry type of musician, a bit like Lully, and made many enemies, maybe a few friends. Gabriel Guillaume apparently had the privilege of friendship with him for a while because they played quite a bit of duets. And it coincides with the time they published duets. Both Guignon and Guillemin were publishing duets at the same time. So, and it's not sure if he played, he had a tragic existence in a way after lots of glory. He also kind of failed. Okay. So in the case of Guillemin, what stands out, I think, is the influence of the music of Bach or the music of from Germany. There's a much more motoric and it's much more vigorous. It has Vivaldi, but also Bach. Sometimes it's almost like plagiarism of Bach. You have copies of the two concerto. I will show you an example in a second. In Sonata 2, and sometimes coloring or some call for the exoticism of colors. Vigorous and very long to play. Lots of accumulation of musical material together. So it's kind of sporty to play this music. So as mentioned here in the Grove mosaic, like I did it procedure. So extensive use of double and triple stops, which makes it not for everybody. And it's always played within the 4 positions. So here's an example of Guillemin. And you see some of these long stretches of double stops. They often they have the same impact in the Bach double concerto, for example. Very fun to play, very vigorous, very energetic. So that creates a very big sound because when you have 2 instruments playing double stops, it becomes like a string quartet. It can be very loud. Okay, some more of this, and I'm going to show you more. So you have sometimes fast scales going by in thirds, alternating thirds that are not for everyone's to play, but the main was automatic. And fast trills are usually necessary. So other bariolage with open strings, very common at the time, and especially over pedals. In the case of the next one, Giardini, he was a student, sometimes mentioned as Lorenzo, but now corrected to Giovanni Bassista. He toured Europe and actually went all the way to London and to Russia, and he died in Russia. So altogether, difficult, sometimes glorious, sometimes difficult because of rivalry. And duet would have been a stage for rivalry. So these are usually very nice, very beautiful to play, but simpler, and that looks like that. So you can see some of these sequences and so on. As for Guignon, I'm going quickly for time. So Guignon was established, as I mentioned to you, as he's an Italian living in Paris and becoming the king of violins. And as he became musician to Prince de Carignan, then he toured with Guillemin and with Mondonville. I think he was a student of his Mondonville or a rival. At some point, he got into an argument with Mondonville. So he published lots of duets, and many of them were in the form of arrangements of famous tunes of the time. My favorite one of Guignon is Les Sauvages by Rameau. It's wonderful, but it's very virtuosic. So that is the characteristics of Guignon, is that it is a virtuoso vehicle, and you need to be really quick on your feet to play this music well. So it's also very similar to Leclerc. When you look at the sonatas side by side, they kind of sound the same. They're very close to each other. But they were direct competitors. Leclerc and Guignon were direct competitors, and Leclerc just basically put his nose up and left away. So here are some examples of Guignon. And notice here the scales going down in staccato that are supposed to be coordinated. So nice effects like that requires quite a high level of skill. Musette with open strings, mineur, and what is that, a giga? Yes, so you can see those explosive gestures that are typical of virtuosity. So opening up in contrary motion, fast, so, and always finishing basically at the fourth position, third position, not going much farther. As for Jean-Marie Leclerc, well, probably there's not enough time to cover, but I'm going to just say just a few words just for a few. So that he was, that's the last one in the list. And in this case, stylistically, what we talk about for Leclerc is the mixture of the Italian and the French. So he's like the epitome of that goût réuni that were described by Couperin. And we see that in the duets as well. So it's just so amazing. I mean, Leclerc has an amazing imagination, invention. So it is, I think what stands out in the case of Leclerc is fugal movements in particular, which is not so typical of the other violinist composer. There's a richness there that requires particular attention. He goes into chromaticism quite often, so it creates sonorities that we're not used to. And there are some pages that are totally special, so nobody else writes like that. So I'm going to give you just a few quick examples. So fast, slow, and you're working as a quartet, beautiful sonorities, and then the fugal style that you can see developing in Largo. Wow, it's so beautiful too. And that's the Opus 12, so much later, but it's still, you see, the style has not evolved that much. But that's it for today. That's it for today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.